This is a question for Debarati. In regards to your critique of fair trade, would you say that fair trade is a step in the right direction, or that it's, throw it out, we need to abandon it and find something new? And if we do keep it, what are the key improvements that, in your opinion, are needed to make it a viable option to bring the voices of women forward? And if we abandon it, and we acknowledge also that consumers have an authentic desire to communicate through their purchases improvement in the lives of farmers and workers globally, what do you see as a better system that has the ability to scale in the way that fair trade has?
Hi, what's your name? Jane. Thank you for that. It's a great question, or a set of questions. Your first question was about, I'm very critical, but ever since I began doing this research, I say it's better than nothing. So I am appreciative, or I always buy fair trade things. It's an irony, because I feel like if you look at different examples in my book, overall people feel that their work is valued more than just the price of the commodity. And I think it's a great thing for so many people to be concerned about not just what they're consuming, but how that's produced. So I wouldn't say that it's throw the baby out with the bathwater. So keep it. But in terms of how we can improve it, I think one of the things which I feel strongly about is for people to get a little bit more involved in learning about the communities. And that's why I focus in on this idea of gender projects of value, so that we don't use this single lens to constantly look at the lives of people who are producing these commodities, right? And also meet the communities where they are, instead of thinking that we know everything that's good for them. Right? We might have great ideas, and they are looking for such ideas too, but we will not be there to overcome the social and cultural and political obstacles in the communities in which they are. So I think if we think about sustainability, for instance, I'll give you one example. A lot of fair trade certifiers don't want to, for instance, indulge in empowering middlemen, right? But you can't do business without going through middlemen. But you'll have to take a lot of initiative, risk, if you want to go beyond, because these trade networks are sustained through families, political parties, bureaucracies, right? Another example I say is in Darjeeling, they want to make women into entrepreneurs. But women are already businessmen in certain ways. So this kind of just-in-time empowerment is not a good thing. We really need to be spending more time as much as we are spending more money, because time is money. So I guess more money. So that's my complicated answer to your very thoughtful set of questions. And we can, of course, talk later on. Yeah, thanks.
Hi there. My question is also on the first talk. And sorry if you covered this in your talk and I just didn't quite understand, but something that I'm familiar with is certifications cost money. They cost a lot of money, and generally they cost on the order of thousands of dollars for each certification each year. And so something that kept going through my head during your talk is, if these so-called illegal farmers are doing organic because they can't afford the chemicals to do conventional tea farming, how can they afford the organic certification and the fair trade certification and any other certification?
Okay. That's a great question. And that is where the plantations come in. So the plantations, are buying their tea. And so what happens is, suppose, I'll say it in dollars because we are not familiar with currency terms. So for instance, if they're paying $5 for green leaf tea, what they do is they'll set aside 50 cents, so that essentially the farmer pays for it, but it's the plantation which secures it from the sale price. They are very expensive, and that is part of the reason why they are so dependent on these plantations. And the plantations also use the small farmer label, right? So these plantations will call themselves champions of small farmers. And also imagine the plantations being fair trade certified was a hugely controversial issue within the fair trade community. Because, how can these bastions of modern day, indentured labor become fair trade certified, especially in tea? So what they do is they have this roundabout way of setting aside money for organic certification. And so what they also do is they have personnel who will go and make these people keep the farm diaries, also provide that. So it's kind of a partnership through the sale of green tea. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. That's a great question.
Hi. So I'm sorry, I'm leaning again also toward Professor Sen. I have a question for you related to what you were talking about with the fempreneurs, sort of developing, once the Fair Trade Organization kind of disappeared, developing their own co-op and trying to figure out how to scale it up. And when you were talking about that, it made me think a lot, in my various work and travels and whatnot related to work, I've always been struck by how so much effort to try to empower women focuses through NGOs on these very low levels of intervention that really maybe help women at a sort of subsistence level, but don't really help women become truly successful entrepreneurs. I was also finding myself thinking about this in Rwanda when I was there a couple of years ago, where the Department of Agriculture was using a very simple app on a cell phone for farmers, for small-scale farmers, to report what they were planting, what their yield was, and then using that as a way to kind of bring all the data together for a number of different purposes. For the farmers, in order for them to put their products together and be able to sell and to improve their situation, but also to gather data for the Department of Agriculture about who were successful farmers in the region, who could mentor other farmers. And whenever I see these kind of NGO-type efforts, particularly with women, I don't see that kind of effort happening. And I would love to hear your thoughts about those kinds of things and whether you're seeing anything around that in your context. Thank you.
Great question. And unfortunately, what you just described is a lot of what you see in these regions. And compared to the rest of India, the India's northeast is very, I hate that word, but underdeveloped. It really doesn't come to the radar of people from the northeast also face a lot of discrimination. So first of all, there are very few sort of gender-focused projects. The only thing that they have been able to latch on to is microcredit, because through NABARD and other state projects, right? The interesting thing here is, there's also a practice of interlending, which is very common among many women in indigenous communities, which is, they call it the ring. So it's a practice of interlending. So this idea of dissociating their own self-help group from the sort of constant NGO dependence is because, they realize that they don't want to be falling into a cycle of loans. They want to now make sure that they circulate this. They are not at all opposed to loans. This is what I say about microcredit. I have a slightly different view. They are not opposed to the loans, but they are very opposed to the way the loans come to their communities. And the kind of differences, first of all, they're taking this outside loan. They face a lot of differences in their household, so who's going to return it? So the women face a lot of adversities. But when they do the interlending, they are very consciously using their capital in a way in which they don't have to depend on these NGOs. And they're also very frustrated with the NGOs. So once, for instance, I went back to this community and they're struggling to get certification and other kinds of things, and they're doing skits of HIV. The HIV was the theme for that year. So all NGOs were getting money for it. And I was thinking, none of them have AIDS. But I thought it was a good thing that they're becoming aware of this, problem. But that's what I mean. It's all very piecemeal. But on the use of cell phones have really revolutionized the sort of petty trade because Darjeeling, if you know, it's 8,000 feet above the sea level. So it's very, hilly. And so these women spend hours just walking back and forth. So they exchange a lot of information, like especially the price, the market price. So I think it would be great to have like an app, but they are not interested in that kind of data. But it could be used for getting that macro perspective on just the amount of informal trade in tea, in other, I don't even know how many kilograms of dry hand-processed tea they are selling. I would love to know. But you don't know. They're like, oh, yeah, I'm making that. I sold 5 kgs. I'm like, okay, you sold 5 kgs. So what did you sell last month? So I think your question is really great. But I'll be happy to share my work, which is more on microcredit and what these farmers do with it. You can talk later on. I know they must.
I'm afraid we have time for just one more question, and then we'll take about a 15-minute break and expect you back, or welcome you back, I should say, at 3:10. Yes, be here. Where are we? I guess right here. And
yes.
I would hazard to say that our speakers will be willing to answer questions privately later on. Thank you.
I have a question that I'd like to address to Sir Paul. I really appreciated your presentation and your concern for the sort of the immediacy of the situation in Japan with the culture. Just myself being literally married into the culture, I've been watching that change just in the 8 years that I've been going to Japan each year. My question for you is this. With the sort of the fires that we're lighting here in the West with tea culture, and especially with focuses on things like Chano-yu, do you think that there's a potential for young people in Japan to, how to say this, how they look to the West and they follow many Western trends, and this is also something I've seen in Japan a lot, with the burgeoning interest in the West, especially here in the West Coast, of Japanese culture. And I can tell you that in our neighborhood, there's a lot of burgeoning interest in Japanese tea culture specifically. Do you think that there's a potential for them to see that we're suddenly getting interested in their ancient cultures, and is this something that could make an inroads to rekindling some interest in Japan for their culture?
This is an interesting question. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. It's a very complicated situation, but to try to simplify it, part of the problem involved in doing what you're saying, and I'll get more directly to your point in a second, is that knowledge of Japanese tea culture is so minimal in the West that that there's little chance of Western interest in tea sort of shoring up traditional types of tea practice in Japan. However, there's more to the story than that. One is, I'm very ambivalent about the idea of foreign interest reigniting interest in the home country, and yet actually that's happening a lot, whether I'm ambivalent to it or not. In fact, if we're looking at ceramic production in Japan, I'm talking about artistic ceramic or even contemporary ceramic that's unconnected to tea, it's exploding in the United States. There's collecting going on all over the United States. There's lots of museum interest. There's exhibitions going on. Recently, an American long-term collector of contemporary ceramics came to Kyoto and brought together 3 contemporary potters that are not super famous, but all have, you know, sort of middle-aged, good careers, numbers of exhibitions, and we were having lunch together, and he asked a very interesting question, you know, what percentage of your production goes towards foreign market? And 2 of them said immediately if the American market disappeared for the production, they'd have to close down overnight. Because although they're making it in Japan, they have almost no Japanese market. Now, this isn't tea, but it's just ceramic, contemporary, so even avant-garde kind of ceramics. One other person said they had a 50% Japanese customers, so that if the American market disappeared, they would be heavily impacted, but they wouldn't have to quite shut down. And so, in other words, this happened earlier in the post-war world with print manufacture. The American interest in collecting woodblock prints, contemporary prints, kept the print market alive for decades in Japan. Whether it really ignited a long-term viable thing is another question, but this has happened in music, has happened in lots of things. So this sort of boomerang effect can happen, although the cultural roots of it are kind of disturbing. I think to look at the problem in a slightly different way is why is this collapsing so way? In some ways, I feel like the tea schools are largely responsible themselves for having sort of over-rigidified their ideas of tea practice. And if you look at tea history in Japan, if you look at the older chronicles, even if you go back to early roots, they were adopting Vietnamese ceramics, Chinese ceramics. They were bringing in Dutch wares, not made for tea, but adopting it into high-level tea practice. Things like that are very hard to conceive of in today's. If it would happen hundreds of years ago, it's proved of. But if it's happening now in the formal tea schools, there's a huge resistance to that kind of thing. That kind of resistance and rigidity is, it's like with the concept I mentioned about the imperial calligraphies. You know, the insistence, if you're going to have something of extreme quality, everything must be of that same quality, or there's something wrong with the aesthetic. But there needs to be a more flexible attitude. Foreigners or just other Japanese who are not part of this system, and there's lots of interest in tea outside of the formal tea schools, people doing it on their own or informally, this kind of idea of developing new forms and new flexibility to how to relate cultural trends with tea and make sort of a viable synergistic world is, I think, still possible. But there are lots of obstacles, and ironically, one of the biggest obstacles are the pyramidal structures of the old tea groups. So foreigners, I think, can play a role in this, and I think for better or worse, it's an observable phenomenon that many young Japanese don't respect their own culture. They don't respect it not because they know it and decided they don't like it. Mostly, they don't know it at all. I've taught lots of Japanese students over the last 20 years, and a lot of them was teaching cinema, and Japanese literature, and art forms and stuff. And many times the class would take a survey and say, "Oh, I don't like this stuff. I don't want it." "Well, what have you seen?" "Well, I'm talking about movies. What have you seen?" They list 10 terrible movies and say, "I've seen these movies, so Japanese movies are no good." "Well, you haven't seen a single good one." I start showing them good ones, and then they're stunned that Japan created these things and so forth. So I don't think that the younger generation, the current generations, are necessarily resistant, but they have very few avenues for a good introduction to their own culture. Increasingly, traditional Japanese cultures are viewed from young Japanese from virtually a Western standpoint, even inside Japan. And this also affects the art world. It's lots of different ramifications. So it's not entirely pessimistic, but there's certain certainly at the moment, there's a state of structural collapse for lots of things. It's very dangerous. A lot of things that are of great value are sort of hanging on by a thread. And so there needs to be new models and new associations and so forth. So I think foreigners can play a role in that.
Thank you.